This is David Murphy, and I have Victoria Vitri on the line. We're going to be giving this presentation on the update of the Hazard Mitigation Plan for the Naugatuck Valley region. Aaron Boudris from NVCOG is also on the call and will be available if there's questions that are better aimed at NVCOG. And go ahead and get started. Should be advancing. There we go. So we will record the meeting. Victoria, go ahead and start if you'd like. And then if we have any technical problems, like if we're all logged out, wait a couple minutes, log back in. If only one of us disappears, the other one of us will continue on. And so don't leave if you see Victoria or me disappearing. We can cover for one another. If comment in the chat box if you have any technical questions, for example, something's not working. But you can also use the chat box or the Q&A feature to ask questions as we go through the meeting. And you can ask questions at any time. We'll try to watch and answer questions as they come up. You don't need to wait till the end. So we'll go through the purpose and the need for the hazard mitigation plan update and the process that we're going through. We'll review the hazards to be addressed, but we won't spend much time on that because we have had other public meetings that talk about the hazards that are being addressed. We'll just mention them once more. We'll talk about the types of hazard mitigation actions that are typically found in hazard mitigation plans. We'll look at some real world examples of hazard mitigation actions. We'll talk about the new actions that we've identified so far for the 19 towns in the region. And there's a map on the right-hand side. If you're not familiar with the 19 towns that are part of the Naugatuck Valley region, it's Plymouth southward to Shelton, as far east, Thomaston down to Shelton, as far east as Bristol in the northeast corner, and westward to Southbury in the central part of the region. We will talk about the regional and state hazard mitigation initiatives that are out there that the state is asking us to include. And then we'll talk about the next steps and just have an open discussion. So the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000, I cannot believe it has been with us for 21 years. This is an act that has encouraged communities to take actions to reduce losses during and after natural disasters. So the act really promotes preparedness and loss reduction. There are 3 grant programs that towns are eligible for accessing if they have a hazard mitigation plan. And they are listed there: Flood Mitigation Assistance, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, and BRIC, which is brand new, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And we'll talk about here in about a minute what kinds of projects can be secured using these grants. But the plan is necessary to be able to apply for the grants. So the plan covers natural hazards. So these are extreme natural events that pose a risk and cause losses. Remember, the act is geared at loss reduction. And hazard mitigation is actions that we can take to reduce those losses going forward. So elevating a building above a flood level is an example of mitigation, because then if a flood occurs, nothing is damaged in that lower level. Or removing a building from a floodplain is another way of reducing the loss. Of course, if there's no building in the floodplain at all, there cannot be any losses. Instead, presumably, the people that would have lived there are living somewhere outside the floodplain. Here in Connecticut, most initial plans are developed well over 10 years ago, 15 years ago for many towns, and local plans are updated every 5 years. Of the 19 towns in the NVCOG region, most initial plans were developed sometime between 2005, 2006, and 2011. And all 19 towns had either their own individual plans or they were part of other regions. For example, Ansonia, Derby, Seymour, and Shelton shared one plan for the 4 of them 10 years ago. What's going to happen now, though, is that all the 19 cities and towns in the borough of Naugatuck will be part of one plan for the region. So I said that there are grants that were available after having a plan that towns can apply for. These are the kinds of projects that can be secured. So building acquisitions or elevations, replacing culverts, bridges, drainage projects, for example, riverbank stabilization, even some landslide stabilization projects have been funded by these programs. And then less commonly in Connecticut, will we see wind and seismic and snow projects. Usually those are reserved for other states that have worse wind, seismic, and snow problems than Connecticut. But the last bullet on here, standby power supplies for critical facilities, of course, that's generators. And so that is a very popular category of grants to apply for. So some graphics here that show the top 5 mitigation project types nationwide. 2018, you can see that acquisitions of buildings from floodplains, flood control, and then elevations of buildings were the top 3. Interestingly, as the fiscal year rolled over to 2019, that category, utility and infrastructure protection, moved up the list to the 3rd place, which is really good news for Connecticut, because here in this state, that's a category that we see our towns getting a lot of money from. And then the most recent fiscal year grants were just tabulated by FEMA, and the graphic on the right-hand side shows that that number 3, utility infrastructure and protection category, is still ranked pretty well, and it's good news for Connecticut. Again, we see most of our grants in that category. Acquisitions and flood control projects are still number 1 and 2, although the sequence swapped, with acquisitions being number 1 and flood control being number 2. These are the hazards that we're including in the plan: floods, hurricanes, tropical storms, summer storms, and the things that come along with those: severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, high wind events, macrobursts, etc. Severe winter storms are going to be in the plan again, as well as dam failure, wildfires, earthquakes, and landslides and sinkholes, which is something that is very specific to the region. Not all the towns in Connecticut find themselves struggling with landslides, for example, but a lot of the steep slopes along the Naugatuck River Valley have caused some challenges for cities like Waterbury and Derby. We're also required to address climate change in the plan for those hazards that are affected by climate change. So these are the types of hazard mitigation actions that are typically found in the plan. There are 6 that we typically speak of, and I'll just run through them really quickly. So public education really encompasses everything, and that's really how we deal with the public, residents, and business owners in the community, and making sure they understand the risks from natural hazards. Emergency services is really geared towards making sure that people have ability to get to shelters, and that town public works facilities, for example, can respond to disasters. So that blue circle right there is really about how we respond during the event. Is it mitigation truly? It's kind of mitigation, so it's not exactly loss prevention, but it does help us manage the disaster as it's occurring and minimize the losses while it's going on. Continuing along the wheel, property protection is floodproofing, storm shutters, really classic examples of how to protect a building or a piece of property. Structural projects is there's a picture on the upper right there of what that could look like. These are the fun ones that cost a lot of money. So removing bridges, replacing bridges and culverts, installing drainage systems, anything that requires a lot of construction equipment is kind of a structural project. Prevention, the one at the top there, it doesn't mean preventing the hazard, it means preventing the loss. So building codes is kind of a really good example of prevention. Regulations also falls into prevention. And then natural resource protection would be setting aside lands that are at risk or restoring lands that are at risk, such as floodplains or perhaps an area prone to wildfires. So if you take those 6 categories and you apply them just to one hazard alone, flooding, you can kind of see there's an infinite number of mitigation actions that can be put into a plan. So under structural projects, under flooding, you would see all the things that we've been talking about. So removing obstructions, detention, creating floodways, replacing bridges, installing flood walls, etc. Under property protection, you see your flood proofing, elevating of buildings, relocating buildings, securing utilities, that sort of thing. So protecting our property. Prevention would be modifying the zoning regulations, the plan of conservation and development, perhaps looking at low impact development, that sort of thing. The other 3 categories applied to flooding. So under natural resources, acquiring land, setting it aside, increasing wetland storage, reconnecting streams to floodplains, that sort of thing. And then under emergency services, it could be building capacities to respond, making sure that critical facilities are not at risk, such as the shelters or the town hall. Establishing new shelters, elevating roads so people can get to shelters if there's a flood occurring, evacuation plans, etc. And then public education could be newsletters. These days, a lot of public education is done through social media and websites, and that can work as well. Here's some real world examples: property acquisitions in Southbury along the Pontbrine River. So these are properties that were repeatedly flooded, single family homes, and some of them have been removed and the land has been returned to open space. And people have moved elsewhere where the flood risk is lower. Here's a project from outside the NVCOG region, but I do like to include this one even when we have limited time, because it was a very expensive project. It was more than $1 million. It was a drainage improvement in the town of Brookfield, which is not too far away, a subdivision that was repeatedly being flooded. And the damage wasn't terrible. You know, people weren't suffering huge losses, but there were issues with septic systems and wells, and water was coming up to front doors, not coming inside. And the town was able to obtain a grant from FEMA to do this work. Otherwise, it would have been difficult to raise funds for it. So these are some of the mitigation actions that have been identified so far. We've been working with the NVCOG towns since about September of last year, having meetings with all 19 of the towns, local planning committees, and we've been asking the town officials and commission members to tell us their ideas for mitigation actions for these plans. Remember, these are all updates, so a lot of the plans already have actions that have been completed. Some of them will be carried forward, but we wanted to make sure we had a chance to incorporate new actions. So some of the things that we're hearing from these 6 categories are conducting new flood studies, looking at stormwater regulations, buying out properties that are flooded repeatedly. We've got a couple that have asked about riverbank stabilization, dam safety, drainage repairs, culvert upgrades. We've got a couple of towns looking at expanding water service because that can help with wildfire suppression. We've got a project in one of the towns about stream daylighting, which means taking a stream back out of being in a culvert underground so that when it floods, there's a place for the floodwaters to go. We've got a lot of towns concerned about tree maintenance and tree limbs and power outages. Some of them want to improve their shelters. We've got a couple that would like to apply for generators. We've got some that want to go for flood warning systems, evacuation planning. And we had one town that kind of said, we're good. We're in pretty good shape. We don't have a lot of new actions. So what we said to them was, aha, we've got some actions for you. And that's where we're going to go next. I'm going to turn this over to Victoria to go through some of the regional and state initiatives that we're putting into the plans.
Right, so thank you, Dave. So the regional and the state initiatives are, they're pretty similar to what Dave just went through, kind of the same idea overall, but just on a larger scale, right? So we're taking a look at these actions that, that the state is kind of passing down by way of planning efforts or regulatory efforts that each municipality can pursue or can implement. So some of them pertain to every community within the NVCOG region, while some are a little more specific, but we'll get into that a little bit more. So the first statewide initiative is for historic and cultural resources. So you could see on the map there that some municipalities in the NVCOG region have a few more historic resources than others, whether it's districts or buildings or facilities. So we can take a look at some of the actions there. And you'll see the next few slides, there'll be a few different options, right? So each option, like I said, some communities, or some actions or initiatives pertain to every municipality, while some are a little more specific. So by way of historic and cultural resources, thinking about whatever municipality you might be in within the NVCOG region, for all municipalities, coordinate with Connecticut SHPO, so that's the State Historic Preservation Office, so to work to conduct these resource surveys, focusing on areas within the natural hazard risk zones to support preparation of resiliency plans across the state. So what does that mean? Identifying those cultural or historic resources that are at risk of flooding or at higher risk of, whether we've got steep slopes or wildfires. So taking those into consideration so that we can better plan around those. And then those towns that have already maybe done some sort of smaller scale survey and they've already identified those resources in flood zones, again, working with this Connecticut SHPO office to conduct outreach with owners of those properties so we can push forward mitigation strategies since they've already been identified. The next initiative is repetitive loss properties. So this map is showing what are called RLP areas, so repetitive loss property areas. So these are kind of generalized areas throughout the region that have continuous flooding issues at properties. So these properties have been flooded more than once, or they've had certain a certain amount of flood claims put in for insurance. So there's some different initiatives for these repetitive loss properties that we can push forward. So any municipality with at least one repetitive loss property, you might have noted in the map that not every municipality in the NVCOG region has a repetitive loss property. Some only have one, some have several. If we were to take a look at the coastline, there's a large number of repetitive loss properties and areas there. But along the riverine, not quite as many here in the NVCOG region. So those with one repetitive loss property, working with DEEP to complete a form validation of a repetitive loss list. So, and then to update the mitigation status of that property. So this means locating that property, trying to identify whether it's been mitigated or not to date, and then if it has or hasn't, updating that with FEMA. So this is also part of a CRS community rating system FEMA program, which I won't get into, but part of that as well. And then for those communities that have 2 or more repetitive loss properties, contacting the owners of those repetitive loss properties, and then those nearby properties, so within that kind of area, to inquire about mitigation that's been undertaken, and then to work with those property owners within that area to suggest flood mitigation strategies to address the issues. So the next one we have are the state building code and flood regulations. So this one's a little bit more regulatory. So the state building code and flood regulations have been updated recently. So we're just making sure that while most municipalities have already adopted the state building code, it's important to identify, those regulations and that kind of threshold, which all municipalities should really be adhering to. So towns with floodplain regulations that do not require freeboard. So freeboard is a certain elevation above a flood, above your base flood elevation. So providing a little bit more mitigation strategy by elevating structures. So for those towns that do not have freeboard, revise your flooding regulations to reflect the new state building code requirements for 1 foot of freeboard. So making sure that new construction is just a little bit higher in those flood zones so they're a little bit more protected. While all other towns, you can compare your local floodplain regulations with revised state model flood regulations to identify any remaining opportunities for improvement. So again, what does that mean? That means taking a look at what the state flood regulations are and making sure that your regulatory standards adhere to those codes. The next we have small business chemical management. So again, this is another one that might pertain to more more urbanized communities. Some municipalities that we work with are a little more rural. This isn't quite as big a concern, but there are facilities strewn about through the region. So we have a few different actions for this one. So the first action is just to provide some information on the town website. So this might include Connecticut DEEP training and information regarding chemical management for hazard resilience. So that might be, understanding how to properly secure chemical management, how to properly store some materials, just making sure this information is provided for those business owners as well as the public in general. We have action number 2. So use the Connecticut Toxic Users and Climate Resilience Map to identify these users located in hazard zones in your community. So again, another resource that is provided to the public to, to identify these hazard areas and identify these potential hazard zones within a municipality. And then also to contact these users to inform them about the management initiative. So again, DEEP has developed this management initiative, so adopting that. And then action number 3, hosting a presentation for municipal staff and local businesses about the chemical management for hazard resilience program. So we kind of stepped through a few of these actions, and these would be dependent upon, how many of these toxic users, chemical management sites are within a municipality. Sustainable CT is another state initiative. So this is a statewide program that any municipality can partake in. They can not just hazard mitigation, but if you were to look up sustainable CT, they talk about energy. They do talk about hazard mitigation. They talk about things like green infrastructure. So a lot of different sustainable programs kind of fall under this sustainable CT program. So we kind of have 2 thresholds here for those towns that are not currently in the program. Register with Sustainable CT, get your community on the list and make progress with the hazard mitigation goals associated with registration. It's a great way to leverage grant funds for certain projects in your community. And then for those that are already registered, there's a few different actions kind of under this action 2, or objectives, I should say. So disseminate a toolkit for pre-disaster business preparedness, so educating your businesses within your community on how to prepare for any certain disaster, whether it's flood or wildfire. Revising your regulations to promote low impact development, which I think we'll just talk about in another minute as well, low impact development. And then include the goals of this hazard mitigation plan with other sustainability concepts into the next POCD, or Plan of Conservation and Development update. So it's a great way to really start to align all of the planning efforts to achieve these objectives and achieve these hazard mitigation and sustainable goals. So the next one, I was hoping it'd be low impact development. It would have been a good segue, but that's okay. So this is a more regional initiative, Resilient Connecticut. This is a planning effort that's currently underway. So for the Naugatuck Valley, you'll see, if you take a look at the map here, we only have a few towns highlighted within the Naugatuck Valley. It's those that are in the green, which you might notice kind of run right along the kind of the major roadways there. So this Resilient Connecticut project is for Fairfield and New Haven County. We're taking a look at climate change vulnerability, flooding, heat, and wind, with a lot of focus on these transit-oriented development communities that have transit-oriented development potential. So think railways, highways, those major access routes for access or egress. This way we can kind of identify this idea of zones of shared risk. So we want to identify those zones that share a certain type of risk. So if that's a flood risk, if that's possibly being cut off because of flooding, so you can't evacuate, or you lose that access point. So there's several different types. And then ultimately pilot projects are going to be developed under this Resilient Connecticut project. So taking a look at those vulnerabilities throughout the region. Again, and it's region-wide for NVCOG, it's just some of the project is focused throughout Naugatuck Valley. So really for each community within the Naugatuck Valley region, it's important to participate in the Resilient Connecticut program. Thank you, Dave. So those with TOD potential participate in Resilient Connecticut, and then those throughout the entire region that may not necessarily be one of those green highlighted towns, just supporting CERCA with the advancement of the pilot projects. So again, the entire region is included in the study, but there's a few different levels that each municipality should participate. So we have those actions. And then here's the low impact development. So here's another statewide initiative. So this is implementing low impact development within communities. So some municipalities already have LID, or low impact development regulations or guidance, and some do not. So for those with current guidance or requirements in their regulatory regulations, refer to the manual. It's the end of the day, my brain's not always working, right? So those with LID guidance or regulations, refer to the manual refer to the manual for additional guidance or regulations. So this LID manual has been developed particularly for rural communities, but I think it's also
Here's a picture of it.
Right. So I think, so the LID manual has been designed for particularly rural communities, but I don't think that it necessarily only pertains to rural communities. I think most, urban communities as well could take a look for guidance and regulations. So many urbanized municipalities are those that already have the LID guidance or requirements and their regulations. So again, refer to the manual. And then those without guidance or requirements, which are often those more rural communities, evaluate whether this can be incorporated into practices or into regulations. So really kind of using this manual as guidance for future development, for smart development. Low impact development helps to, mitigate flooding, thinking green infrastructure, right? So this helps retain floodwaters, helps percolate floodwaters or reduce floodwaters. So a couple different actions here for municipalities, depending on where they stand with low impact development. And I was gonna say, I believe that's it. So those are some of the statewide initiatives, kind of those broader regional scale initiatives, which really often go hand in hand with those more localized actions that have been identified by each municipality. So this is what we've heard from municipalities. This is also what we're incorporating based on state and regional planning actions and regulatory standards. So what's next? So we're taking all of this information that we've heard, chatting with communities, we're taking everything from the state and all of these other planning efforts, ultimately culminating it into the hazard mitigation plan, but we're still working on public engagement. So we do have an online survey, which is open right now. It can be accessed through this link, which we might be able to throw into the chat. But if not, all of this information is also available on the Naugatuck Valley NVCOG and Naugatuck Valley COG website under the Hazard Mitigation Plan tab. There's also a story map that's available. This is also on the NVCOG website, Hazard Mitigation Plan site. The story map is a really great tool to understand a little bit more about hazard mitigation planning, a little more specifics into some of the different type of strategies, and then a little more specific for the region as well. There are some public meetings that we're hosting with the town's Planning, Zoning, and Wetlands Commission, so presenting some similar information, but another opportunity for the public to get involved and participate. Ultimately, we're preparing the draft plan. This will be available for public review, shooting for March, April 2021. Once public engagement kind of wraps up, we can start to incorporate and develop these drafts. Once the drafts are delivered and they're out for review, the public is able to provide comments on those as well. The survey also kind of helps shape the drafts as well. So there's a few different points or a few different opportunities for the public to participate. So those are the next steps going forward. And I believe that is all we have. But we do have time for open discussion because we have a small group. I believe you should be able to unmute yourself. So if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. If you would like to put anything into the chat or into the Q&A box, if you'd rather type it, that's great too. We'd be happy to chat about anything, whether it's, certain hazards that are on your mind, certain mitigation strategies that you feel might be appropriate in your community, or just anything kind of regarding some of these hazards we talked about. So like I said, if anyone has anything, I think you should be able to unmute or post in the chat. We'll give everybody a second to orient themselves in case there's anything.
And I'll just mention, since I'm still unmuted, that the Planning and Zoning Commission meetings coming up, where we're going to be presenting this information, are in Derby, Beacon Falls, Waterbury, Thomaston, and we hope to schedule a few more.
Great. Thank you. Right, and Aaron put the website directly for the Hazard Mitigation Plan site, the NVCOG tab. So that's in the chat if you'd like to visit there, where you can also access the survey. All right. I'm not seeing anything in the chat or any questions, Q&A.
Well, we can hang on for one more minute, I guess, and then if anything comes up, and then we'll go ahead and log out. Thank you, Victoria, for helping with the slides.
Yeah, no problem.
Seems like it's been a long day.
All right. All right, well, I can put the SurveyMonkey survey link in here. There we go. It took me a second to find it just in case folks want to jump right to that. Otherwise, it looks like there's no comments or questions. So any other parting words for the hazard mitigation plan at the moment? I don't know if David or Aaron has anything.
Oh, here's a question. Okay, I'll read it. So it seems that the availability of federal flood insurance encourages development in flood zones. Can we cancel that? Well, there are efforts every year to retool the flood insurance policies of this nation and privatize it as well, which would help make a lot of the policies more aligned with the risk. So I think we're going to see a lot of changes in the next few years. And there's been some positive changes already. I mean, some of the coastal flood insurance policies, people are paying like $10,000, $15,000 a year for flood insurance, whereas they were paying only $1,000. So some of the changes will start to drive some larger scale change. But I think we'll never see federal flood insurance completely go away, only because it's the way that the government sees it as being equitable. Thank you for asking that question.
All right, that's a good question. Okay. Any others? Okay. All right, great. Well, I don't see any other questions or comments, but feel free to visit the NVCOG website. There's the survey, there's the story map, and you can also reach out to Naugatuck Valley, if you have any other questions or concerns and would like to provide any comments on anything, but we'll also be doing that as well when the drafts are released. So if there's nothing else, then I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you, David and Victoria. Nice
Thanks.
job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Have a good
Aaron.
night.
Good night.